On November the 18th, 1978, the Reverend Jim Jones instructed his 918-strong congregation of the People's Temple religious cult living in an extensive compound built in the jungles of Guyana, South America, which is also known as Jonestown, to commit an act of what he called revolutionary suicide. Now, this task was to be accomplished by drinking a poisoned concoction of punch and cyanide. In all, a total of 909 people died at the compound, 304 of whom were babies, infants and children. What has become known as the Jonestown Massacre was the single most deadly non-natural disaster in US history prior to the infamous terror attacks on the World Trade Center of September the 11th, 2001. The massacre also remains the only time in history in which a US congressman has been killed in the line of duty. But before we get into this horrific tale, I'd like firstly to shout out to some of the amazing new subscribers. A quick shout out to just a few of you for now, but this is something that I'd like to continue with future uploads. So a big shout out goes to Stephen Day, Katie O'Brien, Jen Ford, Teresa Chavez and George Zobish. I hope I pronounced that last one correctly. While these are just a few of the folks I've interacted with in this past week, you're all appreciated. I thank you all profusely for your subscription to this new venture. So to all of you newcomers watching this, if I may, I'd love to ask you to hit that subscribe button and ring that notifications bell so that you'll be updated as and when new content is available here on the flip side. In story form, I recount a varied selection of true crimes, cold cases, unexplained events, paranormal activity and supposed alien encounters, at this time just once a week. But as time goes on, and hopefully as this channel gains traction, I'm hoping to upload maybe twice or even 3 times a week. But now, without further ado, let's get back to tonight's tale. A tale that I'm sure will turn the stomachs of many of you. A tale that I must warn you contains some pretty shocking details and imagery. This is the tale of an infamous event that's become known as the Jonestown Massacre. So let's get into that right here, right now, on the flip side. Founded in 1956 by Jim Jones, the People's Temple was a racially integrated church that focused on helping people in need. Jones originally established the People's Temple in Indianapolis, but then moved it to Redwood Valley, California in 1966. Jones, a devout communist, had a vision of a community in which everybody lived together in harmony and worked for the common good. He was able to establish this in a very small way while based in California. Jones found a remote location in the South American country of Guyana, and in 1973 he leased some of the land from the government and had workers set about the monumental task of making that dream become a reality. Now, James Warren Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in a rural area of Crete, Indiana. His father, James Thurman Jones, was a World War I veteran. His mother, Lynette Putnam, a simple woman of rural origins. Jones was of Irish and Welsh descent, although he also claimed to be partial Cherokee through his mother's ancestry. Now, this was a claim that was refuted by his second cousin. In 1934, the economic difficulties during the Great Depression forced the family to move to the nearby town of Lynn, where Jones grew up in a shack without any plumbing. Being a voracious reader, he would consume literature with a passion. However, some of the entities he studied earlier on in life would potentially go on to direct the path of his later years. He would spend hours studying the likes of Joseph Stalin, Karl Marx, Adolf Hitler, Mao Zedong, and Mahatma Gandhi. Now, some would surmise that his prolific reading was the growing boy's way of compensating for his inability to socialize. He was the epitome of a loner. Other than reading, it was said by those who knew him that Jones had a deep fascination with both religion and death. Neighborhood kids are documented as having surmised Jones as simply being a really weird kid. He was somebody who would regularly hold funeral services for young animals, and when no roadkill or other naturally deceased animals were available, he would provide those by killing strays. and on one particular occasion he was witnessed killing a young kitten by stabbing it to death for a particular funeral service that he wished to perform. Now, home life for Jones was no walk in the park. His father, many of whom including Jones, was suspected of being a member of the Ku Klux Klan, for one thing. Given his segregationist stance, he and Jones didn't speak for a number of years after an incident where Jones brought home a coloured friend in order to play. Now, his father was adamant that the young visitor would not enter the family home. A raging alcoholic, James Thurman Jones had been unemployed since returning from the war in 1918. Eventually tiring of life in a wooden shack with no plumbing, Jones's mother packed the boy and herself off for pastures new in Richmond, Indiana. To support himself, Jones worked as an orderly at Richmond Reed's Hospital and was well regarded by senior management. It was at Reed Hospital where Jones met nurse Marceline Baldwin. The couple would eventually marry in 1949. Jones was able to begin his own church, which had various names until it became known as the People's Temple Christian Church Full Gospel, which he then later shortened simply to the People's Temple. Alas, all was not as it seemed. He would perform miracles in full view of his followers. Now, in one such event, a seemingly blind and paralysed stranger in the congregation was seen to stand and eventually run around the auditorium, screaming out the colours that she could see that the other congregation members were wearing. She had restored vision and physical ability. Now, it sent the crowd into deliriums of worship where they would exalt Jones as a true messenger from on high. However, it was eventually found out that the visually challenged and immobile woman was in fact one of Jones's secretaries, somebody who had been for many years in fine form with all of her abilities and senses intact. Now, on another occasion, he was seen to be literally reaching into the bodies of people and discarding lumps of flesh and tissue that he said was cancer. Now, it's amazing what defrosted chicken guts can be passed off as with a little smoke and mirrors. Unhappy with what Jones saw as restrictive growth potential in Indiana, due largely to the reluctance for racial integration, he moved his base of operations to the more open-minded state of California. Jones and his wife adopted several non-white children, referring to both his personal household and the People's Temple congregation as his rainbow family. And he often stated, "Integration is a more personal part of my agenda moving forward." Now, Jones had banned extramarital sex amongst Temple members, while he himself engaged in numerous sexual relations with both male and female members of his congregation. His first known affair began in 1968 with Temple member Carolyn Layton, who remained with him until the events at Jonestown some 10 years later. Jones was also engaged in a relationship with Temple member Maria Katsaris, which began in 1974 and which also lasted until the end. The book, The Road to Jonestown by Jeff Gwynne, states that Jones had occasional sex with male followers, but never as often as he did with the women. Gwynne went on to surmise that Jones was almost likely bisexual, but that his main physical and sexual attraction was towards women. Jones, however, claimed that he detested engaging in homosexual activity and did so only for the male Temple adherents' own good, purportedly to connect them symbolically with himself. Now, on December 13, 1973, he was arrested and charged with lewd conduct for masturbating in the presence of a male undercover LAPD vice officer in a movie theatre close to MacArthur Park in Los Angeles. Jones had motioned to the undercover officer to join him on the theatre balcony where Jones was, but later followed the officer into the bathroom where the incident occurred. Within a few short years of moving to California, the Temple experienced a period of exponential growth and opened up branches in cities such as San Fernando, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. By the early 1970s, Jones began shifting his focus to major cities across California due to the limited expansion opportunities in Ukiah, the quiet town where he had initially moved the People's Temple to from Indiana. He ultimately moved the Temple's headquarters to San Francisco, which was a major center for radical protest movements at the time, although the move to San Francisco also brought increased media scrutiny. It was pushed back to one planned editorial that prompted Jones and the core members of the People's Temple in 1977 to initiate the series of events that would culminate in what we know now as the Jonestown Massacre. Encountering resistance by his editors to publishing an investigative piece about the People's Temple, Chronicle reporter Marshall Kildruff brought the story to New West magazine. In the summer of 1977, and in response to this article to which they had been tipped off about, Jones and several hundred temple devotees abruptly decided to move to the communal settlement in Guyana. The facility was officially called the People's Temple Agricultural Project, but unofficially it became known simply as Jonestown. Now, Kilduff's article included allegations by People's Temple defectors of physical, emotional and sexual abuse. So one question was obvious. If there was nothing to hide, why did Jones run? A phrase that often comes to mind, there's no smoke without fire. Now, when the fleeing congregation arrived in Guyana, they soon realized that what had been touted as a safe and fertile Shangri-La was in fact an insect-infested, mosquito-plagued tract of jungle, replete with venomous snakes and other potentially dangerous critters. Jones had started building Jonestown several years before the New West article was published. It was promoted as a means to create both a socialist paradise and a sanctuary from the media scrutiny in San Francisco. Jones did not permit members to leave the settlement. Once they were in, period. Now, very few people managed to escape the compound, but those lucky enough to do so painted a harrowing story of the pathetic existence led by those choosing to remain loyal to the increasingly erratic Jones. Deborah Layton Blakey recounted in her sworn affidavit on returning to California after having been fortunate enough to escape the living hell of Jonestown, the following words.
When I first joined the temple, Reverend Jones seemed to make clear distinctions between fantasy and reality. I believe that most of the time when he said irrational things, he was aware that they were irrational, but that they served as a tool of his leadership. His theory was that the end justified the means. At other times, he appeared to be deluded by a paranoid vision of the world. He would not sleep for days at a time and talk compulsively about the conspiracies against him. However, as time went on, he appeared to become completely irrational. Reverend Jones insisted that temple members work long hours and completely give up all semblance of a personal life. Proof of loyalty to Jones was confirmed by actions showing that a member had given up everything, even basic necessities. The most loyal were in the worst physical condition. Dark circles under one's eyes or extreme loss of weight were considered signs of loyalty. The primary emotions I came to experience were exhaustion and fear. I know that Reverend Jones was in some sense sick, but that did not make me any less afraid of him.
Now, religious scholar Mary McCormick McGarr argues that Jones's authority decreased after the exodus to Jonestown because he was no longer needed for recruitment and he could no longer hide his drug addiction amongst other vices from rank-and-file members. In spite of the allegations prior to Jones's departure, he was still respected by some for setting up a racially integrated church which helped the disadvantaged. 68% of Jonestown residents were of African American descent. It seemed at this point the writing was on the wall. In any situation, a body of people living together striving for self-sufficiency need two basic components: a source of fresh potable water and edible sustenance. Now, even though they were living in a jungle where one would expect all manner of food to be found in sufficient quantities to sustain Jones and his followers, they were in fact on the verge of starvation. Now, so dire was the situation that it was a little known fact that Jones would actually send out a dedicated core element of his followers into local towns and cities to beg for food. They would return with Spartan fare that would be used to infuse a wildly inadequate diet for the church members. Additionally, in her affidavit, Blakey hinted at the dastardly way in which Jones justified his personal diet, which was rich in all manner of vitamins and calories required to sustain a healthy individual in such a region.
The vast majority of the temple members were required to work in the fields from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m. 6 days per week, and on Sunday from 7 a.m. until 2 p.m. we were allowed 1 hour for lunch. Most of this hour was spent walking from our places of work and then standing in line for our food. Taking any other breaks during the workday was severely frowned upon. The food was woefully inadequate. There was rice for breakfast, rice water soup for lunch, and rice and beans for dinner. On Sunday, we each received an egg and a cookie. 2 or 3 times a week we had vegetables. Some very weak and elderly members received 1 egg per day. However, the food remarkably improved on the few occasions when we entertained outside visitors. In contrast, Reverend Jones, claiming problems with his blood sugar, dined separately and ate meat regularly. He had his own refrigerator which was stocked with food. The two women with whom he resided, Maria Katsaris and Carolyn Layton, and the two small boys who lived with him, Kimo Prokes and John Stone, dined with the membership. However, they were in much better physical shape than everyone else since they were allowed to eat the food in Reverend Jones's refrigerator. In February 1978, conditions had become so bad that half of Jonestown was ill with severe diarrhea and high fevers. I was seriously ill for 2 weeks. Like most of the other sick people, I was not given any nourishing foods to help recover. I was given water and a tea drink until I was well enough to return to the basic rice and beans diet. As the former financial secretary, I was aware that the temple received over $65,000 in Social Security checks per month. It made me angry that only a fraction of the income of the senior citizens in the care of the temple was being used for their benefit. Some of the money was being used to build a settlement that would earn Reverend Jones the place in history with which he was so obsessed. The balance was being held in reserve. Although I felt terrible about what was happening, I was afraid to say anything as I knew that anyone with a differing opinion gained the wrath of Jones and other members.
In the autumn of 1977, Timothy Stone and other temple defectors formed a concerned relatives group because they had family members, including Timothy's 6-year-old biological son John, who remained in Jonestown. Stone traveled to Washington, D.C. in January of 1978 to visit with State Department officials and members of Congress. He also wrote a white paper detailing his grievances against Jones and the temple. His efforts aroused the curiosity of California Congressman Leo Ryan, who wrote a letter on Stone's behalf to Guyanese Prime Minister Forbes Burnham. The concerned relatives also began a legal battle with the temple over the custody of Stone's son. Now, one particular aspect of life in Jonestown that piqued Ryan's investigative nature was the holding of what were called White Nights. These would take the form of Jones waking up the complete congregation in the middle of the night and have them assemble in the main pavilion area of the compound. He would then go into rants that would last for many hours about why they needed to pass on to the other side, and then inform the people that they would, on that night, each be consuming a poison that would ultimately kill them. Surprisingly, the congregation would then drink a drink that had been distributed, only to be told afterwards that in fact they had only consumed a child's fruit drink, and that this had simply been a test of their devotion to Jones and the People's Temple. Now, in 1978, Congressman Ryan led a fact-finding mission to Jonestown to investigate allegations of human rights abuses. His delegation included relatives of temple members, an NBC camera crew, and reporters for various newspapers. The group arrived in the Guyanese capital of Georgetown on November 15th. 2 days later, they travelled by plane to Port Kaituma, where on arrival they were then transported to Jonestown in a tractor transporter provided by the People's Temple. Jones hosted a reception for the delegation that evening at the Central Pavilion in Jonestown. Now, it was during this reception when Temple member Vernon Gosney passed a note meant for Ryan to NBC reporter Don Harris, requesting assistance for himself and another Temple member, Monica Bagby, a way to be able to leave the settlement. Ryan's delegation left hurriedly the afternoon of November 18th after Temple member Don Sly attacked the congressman with a knife. Ryan and his delegation managed to escort 15 Temple members who had expressed a wish to leave the compound. Jones made no attempt to prevent their departure at that time, but those who knew Jones knew that inside he would have been seething. He hated with a passion anyone who wished to leave the temple and had armed guards to dissuade such desertions amongst his congregation. Now, as members of Ryan's delegation boarded 2 planes at the Port Kaituma airstrip, Jones's armed guards, called the Red Brigade, arrived on a tractor and trailer and began shooting them. The gunmen killed Ryan and 4 others near a Guyana Airways Twin Otter aircraft. At the same time, one of the supposed defectors, Larry Layton, drew a weapon and began firing on members of the party inside the other plane, a Cessna, which included both Gosney and Bagby, the 2 individuals who had approached the congressman for help. Now, NBC cameraman Bob Brown was able to capture footage of the first few seconds of the shooting at the Otter just before he himself was killed by the gunman. 5 people, including Ryan and 1 temple defector, were killed in the attack. Numerous reporters and additional defectors, some with severe injuries, managed to escape. Now, what was to transpire in the next few hours in the compound can only be described as a cold-blooded massacre. While many people suggest and call this event a mass suicide, I personally believe suicide is something engaged in and undertaken by individuals who embrace that ultimate act, even though they may be challenged mentally due to depression or other kind of stimuli. Having carried out countless white night drills where the followers would drink a supposed poison that turned out to be a benign powdered fruit drink, led many to believe that the congregation were willing to go through with this latest instruction, giving the thinking that once again they would be told, after they drunk the juice, that this had simply been a test of their devotion. But how wrong they were. After the slaying of the congressman at the airport, Jones called his congregation to the main pavilion area. He then engaged in a long-winded rant that suggested they were now on their own. They had been deserted by the Soviet Union, apparently with whom Jones and the temple had been discussing the option for exodus, something that was now no longer of an option due to the airport shootings. He then went on to raise the issue of suicide by suggesting that intelligence agencies were amassing in the jungle just out of sight of the compound and were getting ready to parachute into their compound, whereupon they would commence the slaughter of all those found inside. As if to leave his ultimate narcissistic signature on the proceedings, Jones even made an audio recording of this rant and the subsequent event where people willingly, unwillingly, and were forcibly made to drink a soft drink laced with massive amounts of cyanide. Those unwilling or unable to drink the concoction, especially the babies, were either injected with the poison or simply had full syringes emptied down their throats. The FBI eventually retrieved a 45-minute audio recording of the complete event. The harrowing cries of the babies and sheer panic in the children's scream is said to be both haunting and incredibly depressing. Now, apparently in the recording, one of the temple members, Christine Miller, dissents towards the beginning of the tape. Jones's wife, Marceline, apparently protested the killing of children and was forcibly restrained. But after a while, she relented, joining the other adults and poisoned herself. Now, at the end of the tape, Jones concludes, "We didn't commit suicide. We committed an act of revolutionary suicide whilst protesting the conditions of an inhumane world." Now, accounts of one of 2 people who chose to act dead in the madness of this moment described the scene. They started with the babies and infants first. The youngest members of the temple were the first to die, as parents, nurses, and those entrusted with their care filled syringes with a potent mix of cyanide, sedatives, and powdered fruit juice and poured it into the children's throats. Adults then drank the poison while armed guards surrounded the pavilion. When the majority of the regular members had drank their poison, the guards would simply drop their weapons one by one, step forward, fill their cups, and swallow their poison. They then simply waited to die. If people refused to drink, they were simply injected with poison. There was only one ordained way out of that compound, and that had been determined by Jones. From ingestion to death, the whole process took an agonizing 5 minutes, and I counted to 300 on numerous occasions as I watched friends and relatives die a slow, torturous death. I never knew that 5 minutes could pass so slow, and what I saw, especially with the children and babies, will haunt me for the rest of my days. Now, following the massacre, Jones was found dead at the stage of the central pavilion. He was resting on a pillow near his deck chair with a gunshot wound to his head. Guyanese coroner Cyril Mutu confirmed the wound to be consistent with suicide. No doubt, having seen the anguish and pain suffered by his congregation, Jones had neither the spine nor the courage to go through the suffering that he was putting his devotees through. He died a coward. Jones's body was later removed outside of the pavilion for examination and embalming. The official autopsy conducted in December 1978 also confirmed Jones's death as a suicide. The subsequent autopsy also showed a presence of the barbiturate pentobarbital. in Jones's body at levels which may have been lethal to most humans had they not developed a physiological tolerance to it. In the ensuing cleanup of the site, the bodies were all repatriated to the United States, where families were finally able to get closure for missing loved ones. Sadly, this also included Timothy Stowen, who had fought for so long to regain custody of his young son John. The body of the young boy, whose plight initiated the visitation by Congressman Ryan to the compound in Guyana, was found among the piles of the victims strewn across the jungle floor. Like so many other toddlers at the site, his life had been cut short by the madness of narcissism. In closing on this story of sadness and barbaric treatment of those looking for utopian peace, all I can say is this. Jones was a narcissistic monster, a man who studied some of the most odious people in human history. He used and abused his position of power to benefit financially, while all the same time abusing physically, sexually and mentally those who had turned to him for light and guidance. Like so many self-proclaimed men of religion, he had predated on the weak, elderly and less fortunate elements of society. He professed a sense of unity, a sense of peace. He strived to create a nirvana for those who simply wanted racially integrated acceptance and a life of simple peace, a life of prayer and devotion. In return, he gave them a living hell. There have been many like him in the past, and sadly, there will be many more to come in the future. So there you have it, folks, the Jonestown Massacre, one of history's darkest moments. Now, if you like this video, please leave a like. But don't forget to also hit that subscribe button. And if you're new, please consider hitting that notifications bell so that you'll be notified as and when new content is uploaded. Now, if you've got a favourite story that you'd like for me to research, please make a note of that in the comments below. Now, if there's one particular story that stands out, I'll then make it a point to create a video about that, along with a shout out to those of you who suggested it. So until the next time, folks, keep it real, stay safe and be well, and I'll catch up with you soon here on the flip side.